Daisy.
And I'm Terry.
And this is the Monday Mindset Podcast,
where we share things of interest to us and hopefully to you.
So let's get started with episode number 256.
And this week, it's Daisy's turn to share something with us. Daisy, what do you have?
Well, Terry, today I have something different for you. Something different but similar. It kind of goes back to actually right before we started this podcast, when we just used to share stuff with each other, which is what we based the podcast on. But it sort of became, well, I suppose right from the start, it was sharing something that was interesting to the other person, but also sort of had some use. So 3 top tips for something, or, whatever. I don't know why I'm explaining this, because anyone who listens to the podcast knows what we do. But you get my point. And there are some things that we listen to that we still tell each other about that aren't really, quote unquote, suitable for Monday Mindset. But this one sort of straddles the line.
Do I
so
look nervous
I would
yet?
share it with you. You needn't be nervous, don't worry. But this is, I'm not even sure I think Apple put it in front of me as a suggestion. I'm not sure why I was scrolling. I think I was maybe just looking for something quick while I was eating my lunch or something. I don't know. I can't remember exactly why. But anyway, this one caught my eye. And it's a podcast called Strangers on a Bench. And it has a nice little graphic, which also caught my eye. And I'll just tell you about this podcast bit before I go on to talk about the particular episode that caught my eye. I sort of scrolled through them all and this one stood out, and you'll know immediately why. But so about this podcast, have you ever walked past a mysterious stranger on a park bench and wondered about their lives? Tom Rosenthal, who is a singer-songwriter by trade, has spent the last 6 months walking the many parks of London, approaching random bench dwellers and asking if he can sit next to them and record their conversation. Every stranger remains anonymous. Neither name nor place of work is ever revealed, even to Tom himself, leading to greater openness, intimacy, and surprising revelations from the participants. So I thought that sounds kind of intriguing. And they're, round about a half an hour, that kind of length. So a nice sort of length to slot in whilst you're doing something else. And this episode is number 17, and it's called Cold Water and the Edge. So rather unsurprisingly, I was attracted by the cold water part, but I was also intrigued by what was meant by the edge part as well. So far, this is the only one that I've listened to, but in this one, he sits down and is talking to this really nice sounding woman. She apparently was painting. She goes on later to talk a little bit about she's doing watercolor painting. But he kicks off, and I don't know whether this might be a starting question for all of them, but he asks her what her favorite day of the week is. I said, yeah, that's an interesting question. Unusual. And she says Saturdays are, because she sees it as a day without obligation. So she kind of talks about the constraints of Monday to Friday being having the obligations of work. And Saturday is her day when she can do things a little bit more freestyle, make a bit more choices. But she is a cold water swimmer. And obviously this podcast is set in London. So I don't know where she swims, but there are different places. I suspect she lives near one of the ponds, Hampstead Ponds, or maybe there's near where my brother lives, he's quite near those, but he's also near this big reservoir where people swim. There's a Serpentine, of course, and of course there's the Thames, but I got the impression that it was one of the ponds or a close kind of environment by the way she talks about it. But yeah, she says that she gets up really early, very early, most mornings to go to swim. And she's talking about like 4:30 in the morning. And apparently this came about during COVID lockdown. And she wanted to carry on her cold water swimming. She didn't say for how long she'd been doing it, but it sounded for quite a long time. And of course, we were all told, certainly here, and it was the same for me in France. I was still in France at the time. But we were really restricted for certain periods of time and not allowed to go outside and do the kind of things like that outside, which I don't think I'm being controversial here in saying that, they're all kind of admitting that was a huge mistake, especially, during the warmer months. We should have been out there in fresh air, albeit distancing. But anyway, so she and a friend of hers started going really, really early, basically in the dark, to avoid getting caught. So it was her little illegal swimming session because she didn't want to stop swimming, and actually got really quite hooked on going at this time of day. She was saying it's such a different environment, especially I imagine in London. They'd be heading there in the dark, quite often actually swimming in the dark, and everything would look different, feel different, and quite often, heading into the summer, even that time of day in the height of summer, sort of 4:30 is when we're getting the sunrise. So, in the summer she'd be seeing the light changing and the sunrise, and just really liked it and got addicted to that time of day. So they've sort of maintained that hobby at that time of day. And of course, before work, I think she's a bit more free in her timings on Saturdays and the weekends. So he asked her a little bit about, so what's the allure of cold water swimming? It's clear that she's really into it. She says, well, it's thrilling on a physiological level. But she said that her relationship with nature has grown by doing it. As I was saying before, interacting with the scenery and the weather and the wildlife. And similar but different from the sea. I don't know if you remember, but I used to sometimes go swimming in a lake in France. And it's a very different environment, obviously, from swimming in the sea, but enables you to go any time of year, which is a great advantage, and any weather. You're not restricted with rough seas. But she shares this with a musician friend, and she says, and I thought this was really eloquent. So she's an artist, not her career, it's a hobby. She's a teacher. But the friend she goes with is a musician. So she says it's a really nice experience to share with her. Her friend opens her ears to the environment, and she, as an artist, opens her friend's eyes to seeing different things in the environment, which I thought was nice. And she says she really likes pushing herself to the limit and has to watch that tendency a bit. She talks a little bit how you're supposed to ease into cold water swimming and how it can be a little bit dangerous. Don't go jumping in. Don't do it like the stupid Wim Hof program where you're jumping into icy cold water, because you can literally kill yourself. But she says that she quite likes pushing herself to this limit, and this is where the edge comes in. She likes the edge and pushing herself to it. Apparently she's also a marathon runner and pushes herself physically there as well. But she says this edge, this place that's the edge, that this is where things happen. Sometimes there might be something that you intended or decided to do, but when you get to this edge place, something more instinctive and intuitive takes over. And she talks about her art and how she likes to approach this in a similar way, where she sort of goes to this edge place and leaves things open enough for something more intuitive and instinctive to come in. She talked about playing around with her art, with watercolor. She's trying to teach herself how to do it at the moment, and really embracing the mistakes. And she says, she makes some comment at some point about messing something up, and he says, oh, you can blame it on me. And she says, oh no, I mess it up all the time. She said, but that's part of the process. Yeah, so she mentioned that she's a teacher. Apparently she's a postgrad teacher, and the art is her hobby. He asked her a bit about teaching and also about her kids. She's got 4 kids, And he asked her what she's sort of most pleased with, what she's most proud of, what her, what achievements. She's kind of a typical Brit. She's a bit sort of, she's very humble and finds this question a bit difficult. And she says, well, they're just the fact that they're all alive is achievement, which there's a bit of a pause after this. You think that's it's kind of, first of all, it's like, oh, that's kind of a funny answer, but it goes into something a lot more deep. And they talk about how she knows, either personally or through friends of friends, quite a few young people who've killed themselves fairly recently. And I think they were all young men. And they talk a bit about that. And is it a part of modern life and the discussion around that? And she says that, it's a challenging time we live in, the politics, the environment, the system that just sucks money and gives it to billionaires, and how we feel this powerlessness. And she sort of ties it in with education and how there's this sort of slant away from thinking about arts seriously. I don't know what she teaches, but I would guess something in the arts side of the sort of arts, science subjects. I don't know. It might just be something she explores in her hobbies. But she obviously, you talk about identity. This is obviously something that's really part of who she is. And she thinks it's important. And she thinks younger kids should be taught and be less restricted in education and be sort of taught and left to experience and explore relationships a bit more and the arts, and not just, focusing on money and how to get on. It's just that young people are not really given enough space these days to figure out who they are and what they truly want to do. And she talks about back in her day, and this is back in my day, so I'm guessing, similar sort of age, how here in the UK anyway, it was a much more relaxed environment from the welfare state point of view. So artists, be they artists, painting artists like her, but musicians and anyone in that creative sphere could harness, shall we say, the welfare state quite productively and creatively. So artists would sign on and get the dole, so get support from the social security system and access social housing and things, and maybe do a little bit of cash work on the side. But she said, and I can hear some people, sort of intake of breath there, but it just gave, in particular, I suppose, these kind of people the freedom to explore their creativity a bit. And some great artists have been born out of that environment. And she says, she feels that it's a real shame that there isn't that kind of support system in place. And indeed, going on to something a bit more formal and organised. University, I didn't have to pay to go to university. Of course, there were costs involved, like accommodation and things. But so all these things have changed and become more difficult for young people these days. Made me think of a model that I remember reading about. I don't know whether it was floated in one of the Scandinavian countries, but this idea that every single person should be given an amount of money that is enough to exist on, whether they want to work or not, to level the playing field. And obviously there were some staunch critics of this and saying, well, people will do nothing. But the supporters of it were saying, well, no, that it will give you the freedom to explore who you are, who you want to be, creativity, entrepreneurship, all these things. So it felt like it was harnessing into that way of thinking, a very socialist, I guess, way of thinking. But I just thought she was very, very interesting. She talked about tying back into this idea of pushing to the edge, how the world is always renewing and in flux. And we tend to, a lot of us anyway, want to fix things in place. And we should be a bit more open. And it made me think of the fixed versus growth mindset. And everything she was saying and the different things that I've highlighted from their conversation, very much I would put her very firmly in the growth mindset category. Just very open to pushing herself to this place where she could be more creative, more tap into that intuition and instinctual way of being, your sort of true essence, but also talking about really wanting this supportive environment that nurtures people to allow them to push themselves to this place rather than always having to be focused on earning enough money to pay for their rent, which is another thing, she ranted about the cost of all this being too high. So, yes, so I suppose, not potentially having much to share. I sort of told you about this episode, but it did, I feel like, bring up just a lot of things that we touch on. So I thought it was relevant to what we do, but just an absolutely charming little podcast that I'm going to go and listen to many more episodes from. There are lots of intriguing titles.
It sounds like fun. And there are several podcasts, and I can't even think of them right now, that are really popular, like This American Life and a couple others that really are just diving into someone's story. There's no, come learn how to save your brain health. But in listening to it, I don't know, just that kind of human connection that does stretch you. The other thing I was thinking as you were talking is, there's so much research out there about learning and the impact on learning when you bring creativity in it, the teaching creativity and the effect that has on younger people especially, but, they become absorbed in their learning and they actually acquire new skills more easily when creativity is there. And so it sounds like, she's kind of tapped into that. And then the other research line that kind of fits in there is that play, again, really enhances learning. It motivates learning. It teaches cooperation and engaging with others and problem solving and all kinds of things. Whereas the other part that you kind of mentioned is once we start focusing on, I have to learn this so that I can do well on the exam, so that I can get a good job. It kills so much of that. And I have a skiing analogy. Oftentimes when I'm skiing with someone and they are better than me, they will ski to a little bit more of a flat part that is right before the edge of going down another steep part that you can't yet see what's there. So they'll stop there and I'll come up and we'll talk for a second and, kind of make our plan and just check in. How was that and everything. And then they always just, obviously listeners can't see this, but they will stand there and just like straight on dip down into that unknown, that part that we can't yet see. And up until just really this week or so, I have gone up to the edge and then tried to look over and see where's the least steep part. Where will I be safest? And what's interesting and what I finally learned this week is that when I do that, I then start over that hill and I hold my breath and I go sideways across because it's less steep. But it actually makes it harder. I'm doing more work. Whereas if I had just leaned in to going over that edge, then making my next turn is actually easier. And I feel like there's this metaphor there of, when we're almost resisting the edge and afraid of the edge, it makes things harder. It holds us back. It doesn't offer us some of the same experience. And I've really just started to experience that with skiing, that now I can be one of those people who comes up on an edge and it doesn't matter. And I will clarify for anyone listening, I am not skiing off-piste. I'm not skiing out in, the backcountry where who knows, maybe there are big rocks right below. Or
there's a certain amount of knowing what's over
I know that it's a run that has a hill and it's groomed and it's safe in that way. So I've really liked this piece about the edge and, it just really connected for me in this recent acknowledgement for myself that I need to approach the edge differently and just go headfirst into it rather than, trying to like put on my brakes and barely skid into it.
Yeah, I just loved the conversation that they had. And he just did a very quick video on YouTube, and I'll put the link in the notes, where he's just telling people about, this new podcast. It's not new anymore, but when he was starting it, about what it's all about. And he's saying, there are no celebrities. It's just ordinary people. And it made me think of the thinking behind Keto Women when I started that. It was all about, okay, yeah, I had some celebrity guests, but it was mostly talking to ordinary women about their extraordinary stories. And I think this conversation in particular, and I'm sure the others are the same, just goes to show what you can take away and learn from complete strangers. Well, we've both explored different things, and it triggered that analogy in you and some thoughts in you. But I just love this whole idea of pushing yourself towards that edge, towards that slight unknown, where there's this open space where your own instinct and intuition can take hold and help guide you. I really liked that. I'm one of these people who gets a bit anxious when things aren't, completely planned out and I know exactly what's happening. And so, it's something that I need to practice a bit more, because the real joy does come from those moments where you push yourself to that place and something unexpected happens.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, there you go. A delightful and charming new podcast to tickle your earbuds with.
I'd be curious about the other episodes, but it's also really nice in this one. It's not like he met someone who he knew her resume and said, all right, I'd like you to produce a TED Talk on motivation or on this or, whatever, that it really just, this inspiring story and insight comes from just having a conversation. It's really cool.
Yeah, that's the other thing we've touched on in a few episodes, isn't it? Having these small, brief social connections often with strangers. You talking about the potential of having these little mini connections with people on the ski lifts, just embracing those opportunities. It made me think of that as well.
Yeah.
And how fulfilling they can be, just that little snippet of a moment.
Absolutely.
Brief connection. Okay, well, until I see you next time, I hope you and everyone at home has a very wonderful week.
Take good care, everyone.